Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for our 1 hour lunch and learn on tree failure and storm cases. Great to have you here. For those of you who are joining live, then hi, great to have you here with us. Hope you enjoy your lunch as you're listening to the speakers. And for those of us that are watching us on catch up, thank you very much for clicking on this video to learn a little bit more about storm claims. Right, I thought I'd just do a quick hello to introduce the speakers. So we've got 4 speakers for you today, the running order of which is, first of all, we have Anthony Byers, who's joining from Zurich Resilient Solutions. He'll be talking about risk and managing risk from trees from an insurer's perspective. Then second, we have Kieran Hart, an arboriculturalist and owner of Tamla Trees. Kieran will be talking to us about tree inspections. Then third, you've got me doing a little bit of a lowdown on case law around storm damage and tree failure claims. And then to finish off, we've got Dr. Tim Fairwell, who will be talking to us a little bit about climate change and how things may look set to change with the climate. When we finish off, then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. You'll all have noticed that you're automatically on mute with your cameras off because this is a webinar. So if you've got any questions, please put them into the chat box, into the Q&A, because we'll be fielding those questions at the end and answering those that we can. So without any further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker, who is Anthony Byers from Zurich. Anthony, reveal yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Sarah. As Sarah has noted, I'm Anthony Byers. I'm a liability risk consultant working for Zurich Resilient Solutions. And what I'd like to talk to you today about is tree risk management in the context of storm damage. So this short presentation, we're going to look at the impact of storms on tree risk management planning. When it comes to planning, I always like to think of the analogy of driving your car. If you drive your car and you only look at the mirrors, you're going to be involved in a crash. Proactive risk management is so important when it comes to tree risk management. That's why it's always important to ensure that you're looking ahead, you're understanding what could affect you, what could go wrong, and that you have the best resources and plans in place to ensure that you can react to an event when it does occur. The first thing that we would look at when it comes to the current context of tree risk management is we have in the past had the ability to effectively wait for a complaint to come in before we react to it. However, nowadays with the named storm events that are coming up, we're less likely to actually have that to fall back on. We are more likely to be expected to have plans in place and to put actions in place when we know that a storm is coming. And also, we do like to look at how we can optimize this process to ensure that we're doing the maximum we can while still being reasonable in our approach. The first thing that we would suggest is to have a strong strategy and policy in place. So building the strategy and policy that supports a reasonable reaction to storm events is massively essential. When it comes to the pre-storm, when you know that storms are coming, it's essential to understand who you're going to have to react to inspections and to carrying out remedial work. You also need to think about what training is required for those individuals, as well as what documentation exists. Because I do work within an insurer, documentation is massively important to us. So when it comes to claims defensibility, documentation is key. If it's not written down, you effectively don't have proof that it ever happened. Therefore, there will be quite a few times where I refer to documentation and its importance throughout this. Post-storm. Once the storm actually occurs, you do need to monitor your progress and your actions that you take and be able to triage areas required for further assessment or for immediate work. And again, you need to document the decisions that you are making. Again, when it comes to understanding the areas where storm damage has occurred, this is massively important when it comes to ensuring that you're doing what's right with the resources that you have. You may find that a tree falls within a low occupancy or low risk area. It may be more appropriate to make safe the site rather than actually carry out any desired works. And again, This all comes from having an effective plan in place that allows you to understand what areas you have under your area of responsibility and what appropriate responses you would then engage with. Part of the reason this call came about and this webinar came about is after Storm Eowyn. It's a fascinating storm, and as myself, if none of you have guessed, I am from Scotland. I don't have a very strong Glaswegian accent, but I'm a Glaswegian. However, the Storm Eowyn struck us very heavily in Scotland, especially around the Central Belt, and it had a similar effect in Ireland, Northern Ireland specifically. The amount of storm damage I saw there was really unprecedented. We haven't had a storm like that in the last 10 years. However, we have had similar storms and storms which have followed up. And what we do find now is we are getting more advanced notice of these storms. For Storm Eowyn itself, there was nearly 10 days that we had in advance notice that a heavy storm was going to come, and all the conditions were right. That would mean that we would have to have a reasonable expectation that a reaction would be needed. Did every organisation, did every local authority have the appropriate response in place? I don't think so, because there was a lot of struggling to actually get out and to understand the impact and where trees had fallen. And again, that goes back to the policy and strategy argument that I made earlier. If you don't have effective planning in place, you're going to increase your workload phenomenally when it comes to react to storm damage when it occurs. When it does come to storm damage, when we talk about tree risk management, we tend to talk about ground movement and subsidence an awful lot. However, over the last 5 years, I have looked at claims that have occurred that involve trees of all types. And one thing that I did find, what did surprise me, was actually storm damage itself is still our most costly type of damage. We do reserve quite highly for ground movement, for subsidence. However, when we start looking at the amount of claims that we actually end up paying out on, storm damage very quickly overtakes the ground movement and subsidence. So the total cost is significantly higher. So therefore, there's a cost imperative as well as a moral imperative to ensure that we're adequately planning and preparing for storms when we know that they're going to occur. So how do we enhance claims defensibility when it comes to storm damage? Again, said before, having a clear policy and strategy in place ensures that you already have a plan ready to enact when a storm does occur. Understanding your zones, your areas of high risk and low risk, this is extremely important when it comes to tree risk management. It's not reasonable and it's not fully expected that you're going to be able to go around and inspect every single tree after a storm, even though all trees may be affected in some way. However, it is important that you understand where are the trees that are situated close to public spaces, roads, parks, nurseries, schools, these type of things. Where are those areas, and how do you rapidly get out to them and ensure that you're adequately inspecting them to ensure that you've done at least the minimum amount to make an area safe. You also need to establish training requirements. Post-storm inspectors, and I'm not going to go into the regimes of inspection too much because Kieran is going to talk about that a little bit later. But post-storm inspectors is a fairly new concept that we've come up with and we've thought of in regards to storm events. These are individuals who are not necessarily the Monday to Friday tree inspectors that you'd usually find. These are individuals who may be pulled from other departments who can quickly go out and cover a route to confirm if there's any obvious defects to trees, and they can document very quickly the response and what they've found, and then pass it on to other more qualified inspectors, risk managers, tree surgeons to make a decision on the final response that's required. Essentially for those individuals, though, what they would need training in is their own safety as well. Naturally going out and after a storm and looking at trees that may be liable to fall down, the safety of the individual is paramount in that as well. And then having the training requirements there established for your inspectors, tree surgeons, and also risk managers themselves, so that they fully understand their roles and responsibilities when it comes to post-storm events. Again, coming back to the documented proof, ensuring that you do have documents that are there ready to go that allow you to fully justify what actions you're taking. And also to justify when you're not taking action. Sometimes that's just as important, if not more important, because an area where you've decided not to take action, if subsequently a tree falls or property damage ensues, injury, or at worst case scenario, a fatality, having the ability to justify and say, no, the reason we took the decision not to have action was X, that still offers you a phenomenal amount of claims defensibility. And again, communication with stakeholders, this is something that will massively enhance claims defensibility because it shows that you're reasonably doing everything you can. This doesn't mean to say that it should just be one way. It's not simply enough to have a line of communication open from members of the public to speak to yourself as a local area authority or an organisation to report complaints, but also for yourself to proactively engage with the community to say, you know, we know that a storm's coming. Here are some of the things to consider, or here are high occupancy routes. These are the ones that are going to be inspected first, and sometimes even communicating that you have inspected. Here's areas to avoid, or here's justification for certain actions that have been taken or not been taken. This can massively instill confidence and also enhance the safety within the public domain. And again, as said before, especially when you're talking about post-storm inspectors, these may be individuals from other departments. So liaising with other departments to ensure that you do have access to those resources can be extremely important. The inspectors that immediately come to mind for myself when I think about that is highways or roads inspectors. These are individuals that are used to going out and checking for defects on roads. It wouldn't take much training to have them additionally trained to carry out post-storm inspections and point out obvious defects. And again, they would be used to the documented approach for this as well. So that's everything from myself just now. I hope there's been a few things that I made you think there. And I'm now going to hand over to Kieran, who's going to speak to you about tree inspections. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can see my presentation. I'd just like to say thank you to Sarah for having me along this afternoon. Basically, what I'm going to look at here is I'm going to look at trees that fall over. So in my line of work, I troubleshoot cases where trees have fallen over for insurers and loss adjusters. What I'm not going to talk about is I'm not going to talk about the stuff that you'll read about in textbooks. Basically, what I've done is I've gone through the cases that I've been doing for the last 17 or 18 years and tried to look for commonalities in why basically these events occur. And this is what I'm going to talk to you about. So what are the common denominators when I'm asked to go and have a look at a tree that's failed? There are specifics as they relate to the locations. What is it about the tree itself? The damage? Information and investigation. I mean, when you're approached regarding a tree that's failed, you have the information that was gathered at the time of the failure, because you're generally not able to be on site quickly thereafter, and then you have the information that comes to you following your instruction and your own investigations. A little bit on what I call the power of the stump. I'm often contacted and asked to have a look at trees. I'm told that there's nothing left because it's all been cleared away. And, you know, from having had a look at hundreds of these over the years, I'm a strong believer that actually, if you've just got a bit the stump, you can actually glean often a heck of a lot of information and just follow up with some conclusions. So what are the common denominators? When I get instructed, it will be potentially because somebody's been killed. potentially because somebody's been injured. But more often than not, it is damage to a property. But it was windy. Often what I get in the instructions is that either, people will dismiss that that it was anything to do with the tree because it was the wind that done it, so to speak. But that's very rarely, in my experience, what has the direct cause of the failure events that I see. Just a little bit on wind, though. Wind will blow over, in inverted commas, healthy trees. When it does so, it usually heaves up quite a big chunk of the ground, like this image. This image is from just north of Galway from a few weeks ago on the west coast of Ireland. And, this tree has heaved up a big chunk of the ground in falling over. And there's literally, there was hundreds, if not thousands of them around. And that was a severe weather event, but that's not what I'm really looking at. When I look at trees that have fallen over, invariably, there is something wrong with them. The oak on the left, you don't need to be a tree guy to work out that there's quite a lot of problems with the root system there. And then this London plane tree on the right, for people who are experienced in looking at trees, you'll be able to see the modification of wood in the exposed roots there straight away.
Kieran, can I just say that your slides aren't moving forward, so I'm not sure if you started clicking through them yet, but just to flag up if you have.
Oh, well, crikey, yeah, okay. Thanks.
Sorry to interrupt. Fab, thanks.
Has that made any difference, Sarah?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we're now looking at the breakpoint low on stem slide.
Okay, so if I click forward, does that then change? Is there any change?
No, it isn't. Can you start the slideshow up on your top browser there?
Sorry.
Oh, that's changed now to the breakpoint stem.
Okay, so it's just taking a little bit of time to do it.
Okay.
So the tree will either have broken at the base, at the roots, at the stem base, or a midpoint on the stem, more rarely. I'm just going to check, is that now moving forward? Can you now see a tree crushing a car?
No, sorry. Yes, it is now.
Okay, well, look, I'll just run it like this. It's not full screen, but I think this is going to be the way to do it for me. Apologies, everybody. So generally, the tree was alive. Hopefully, that's moved forward to a slide where you can see some fungi. There were usually signs that the tree was potentially had problems. And in terms of rot, I never get instructed when there was none. As you can see on this piece of wood here. Sometimes when the type of rot is what would be called a brown rot, which is what this sample of wood is showing you here. But more often than not, the type of rot that I am seeing is a white rot. Just because of the nature of these, it usually comes out at about 4 or 5 out of every 6 or 7 instructions are white rot based. So it's very, very common. In terms of the location, it will be beside a road or within falling distance of a house. And invariably, it will be in private ownership. The tree will usually be an oak, a poplar, or a beech. It will virtually always have been greater than 15 meters in height and greater than half a meter in stem diameter. which somewhat begs the question that an awful lot of time and money must be spent inspecting trees that are significantly smaller than this, which, you know, statistically the risk of failure is even lower than you would imagine. The tree will have been alive, but it will have been decayed. Just in terms of the decay, just a quick word. It's not always, I mean, there are limitations to it, to a presentation that's this short. Branches do fail from trees, but usually it's decay. And that decay for me is, the cases I look at, it is honey fungus, in second place is Ganoderma, but number one on the claims that I look at, the decay fungi was a fungus called Kretschmeria diusta, for lots of different reasons. Just in terms of the damage, I don't want to be sensational in this in any way, shape or form. The risk of tree failure events causing fatality and property damage are pretty low. Trees are inherently safe. Most of the trees that fall over do so in environments where they're not going to do any damage or cause any problems. But where people are killed or where buildings are damaged, people want answers, or there may be very expensive litigation involved. Most of the cases that I get involved in that relate to tree failure events that kill and injure never go to court, so they remain unreported. Just in terms of the information and investigation, if somebody has been injured or killed, usually the information that comes to you is pretty good, because the police or the fire brigade have been involved and they've taken a lot of photographs, they've taken a lot of information, and that can make the life of somebody trying to unpick the claim a lot easier. Where property damage occurs, it tends to be much less, you know, the information tends to be more sort of sensational shots, a bit like this, of a tree through the property, rather than the information that a guy like me particularly wants. So just in terms of the power of the stump, I'll quite often be told there's only a stump. I'll turn up on site, turned up on the site and see what's on the left. It's just an ivy covered stump. With a little bit of digging around, you can uncover what's going on there. And the amount of information that can be gleaned from these stumps is often huge. This tree here, you know, the cut stump, this is all that remains. You can see the extent of the decay, the arrow on the right, and then you can see the rather innocuous looking fruiting body on the left of this, in this instance, Kretschmeria. On some stumps, the information be a little bit more obvious, but there's usually, it's very rare that I look at a tree, even when there's just a stump and there wasn't possible to glean pretty good information from it. And in fact, on this case, a girl was unfortunately killed when a bus hit this tree and the tree popped out the ground. And by the time I got to the site, they'd already tarmacked over the tree pit, and we were able to excavate the tree pit, take samples of the wood, and then send them for laboratory analysis to determine that the tree had perenniporia, which affects London plane in this instance. So just quickly on image information gathering, if you're faced with it, what we, you know, obviously for insurance purposes, you're going to want what's on the left, but what people like myself want often is the image on the right, showing the break point and the decay. So be consistent and systematic. I have a checklist that I take to site when I do these assessments, and I make sure that I go through it systematically every time. Make sure you take high quality images, photograph the break point, and if at all possible, retain a section in the stump. Yeah, and make sure the stump isn't removed. There's often a dash to tidy up after these kind of events, and information can be lost. So just in terms of conclusions, tree failure events are rare. Species size and location, there is a pattern to it. The inspections, well, there was often a defect present before the failure event in my experience. The wind will have applied the load potentially that led to the failure event, but it's not the cause, because without the weakness, the tree wouldn't have fallen over generally. Gather and retain the right evidence, and don't remove the stumps. And thank you very much. And apologies about that not running properly, but thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. The slides worked there in the end. Right, now my turn to have a go with the slides. Bear with me. Right, can someone give me a thumbs up or nod as to whether you can see that? Great, I think that's a yes. Hi everybody, so I'm doing the legal slot, no surprise there, and this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some case law. So don't worry about making notes, because a lot of the notes are going to be on the actual slides. They're quite busy with words, so apologies for that. But because I'm talking about case law, the facts are king. So actually, before I click on that, so the frequency and severity of recent storms has left images of trees fallen on cars, houses, roads, and even railway lines in our minds. With storms seeming to occur more frequently, it's worth a revisit of the law relating to these claims to see how, whether the law might change in relation to these dramatic events. As my slot here is only 10 minutes, I'm sticking to talking about civil claims, but just flagging up that there are also criminal claims, for example, when the Health and Safety Executive might get involved. Branches falling and the tree eventually falling, as Kieran has just said, are part of the natural characteristics of a tree as a living entity. However, where there is a failure and that causes damage to people or property, there's a possible legal claim against the tree owner. Where storm events are getting more frequent, are these legal claims going to increase in number too? Well, the starting point with case law is to go back to basics in relation to legal tests. In civil law, these claims brought are likely to be in negligence, nuisance, and under the Occupiers Liability Act. Even before we get to the negligence case of Donoghue and Stevenson in the 1930s, there was the case of Noble and Harrison in 1926. In that case, there were injuries caused from a falling branch, with the branch falling as a result of a hidden defect. The court found the tree owner not liable, setting out that the landowner is, quote, not expected to act as the insurer of nature. And you see that phrase used in later case law. This is an expression which continues to be referred to in today's court judgments. For the purpose of all of these claims, the legal duty is similar. It goes all the way back to the old negligence principles in the 1932 case of Donoghue and Stevenson. That was the snail in the ginger beer bottle case, where the court found in that case that the duty of care in negligence is to take reasonable care to avoid acts or omissions which you can reasonably foresee would be likely to injure your neighbour. But moving away from that ginger beer case and into tree law cases, this was referred to by the House of Lords in the case of Kaminer versus Northern and London Investment Trust. This is a House of Lords case, so they are, the top dogs. So in that case, the claimant sustained injuries from a fallen branch. The question asked of the court was whether the defendant was negligent as the tree in question had not been inspected. This went all of the way to the House of Lords, who held that the defendant was not liable as the defect that led to the failure was hidden from view and would not have been picked up on an inspection. The court reiterated the Donoghue versus Stevenson duty of care and held that the tree owner had adhered to the standard of conduct to be expected from a reasonable and prudent landowner and was not found liable. Moving away again from tree cases and into the old case of Leakey versus National Trust. This is a 1980 case and involved a landslip. Now, this case introduced into law the notion of a measured duty of care. In that case, soil had slipped from the defendant's land to the claimant's land, and the court set out that there's a general duty on occupiers in relation to hazards occurring on their land, whether those are natural or man-made. The duty is to do that which is reasonable in all the circumstances and no more than what, if anything, is reasonable to prevent or minimise the known risk of damage or injury to one's neighbour or their property. All a bit of a mouthful, but it's very much that balancing act. A measured duty of care, the standard of care under the measured duty, takes into account the specific subjective circumstances of the defendant. A few cases applying this measure of duty of care show 7 cases in which the defendant tree owner was held to be liable and not liable, and 2 where they were liable. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but I'm going to go through them. So these are the cases which have been reported where the tree owner was not found liable, and keep an eye out and see whether you see any commonalities amongst these cases. Right, so kicking off with them. We have got to start with McClellan versus Forestry Commission in 2005. In this case, we had a tree which collapsed onto a woodland path, and the Forestry Commission were found not liable as there was a low level of risk with low level access and the absence of any obvious signs that the tree was problematic during inspections, although those inspections were casual. Next, the following year, in Corkett versus Wilson, a branch fell and hit a car. The tree was regularly, but again, informally inspected and inspected within 12 months of the incident. The defendant was found not liable as the branch failed due to a non-visible defect. Again, the National Trust in Bowen versus National Trust in 2011. School children sheltering under a tree and a branch fell and killed a child. The court found there was no breach by the National Trust as they only had a duty to take reasonable care and to provide reasonable safety to visitors. This was a medium risk zone and inspections were carried out every 2 years. Micklewright and Surrey in 2011, the decay in this situation of the tree was internal. Even if an inspection regime had been carried out, it would not have revealed the tree's condition, and it would have been unlikely to prompt the appointment of an ARBO, although it was accepted that an ARBO would have diagnosed the condition had they been instructed. And a critical case here, Stagecoach and Hinds in 2014. I say critical because the court took the opportunity to reiterate 4 of the main points. So in this case, this involved tree in the ownership of an individual. So an ash tree from the defendant's garden fell across a train track. The defendant was found not liable, with the court setting out the principles in these cases in 4 points. So these are worth bearing in mind. This is a good reiteration. So the first one being that the owner of the tree owes a duty to act as a reasonable and prudent landowner. This meant that the landowner has a duty to act where there is a danger which is apparent to them. Remember that measured duty of care from Leakey. And then thirdly, a reasonable and prudent landowner should carry out a preliminary or informal inspection on a regular basis. And this may extend to fuller inspections by a qualified arborist, such as where a potential problem is revealed or particular risk perceived. And then finally, for the resources available to the landowner may be relevant, such as where the landowner has particular knowledge about trees. Again, that measured duty. Another couple of cases here. I'll skip over Parker. We've spoken about the National Trust quite a bit. Let's go to Hoyle in Hampshire. This is another one that you're probably all familiar with. So in 2022, a cherry tree fell onto a car, an allegation of negligent tree inspections. The tree was inspected twice within the 16 months before the incident, and the finding was that the tree had no visible signs of decay, and its failure was due to a combination of wet ground, asymmetrical growth and high winds. The inspections were found to meet professional standards, and no competent inspector would have identified the tree as an immediate risk. So moving on to the 2 cases where the tree owner was found liable. Now, again, I said these aren't an exhaustive list. These are just a couple of examples, and I've highlighted actually the risk elements here, because I really think this is why the decisions were different. So the first one is the case of Whitley Parish Council in Cavanagh in 2018. A tree here fell in stormy weather in 2012 onto a bus. The tree had been inspected every 3 years. The court found the tree was in a high risk area and should have been inspected no less than every 2 years. This would have identified the decay and prevented the accident. And then finally, in Collar and Singh versus Highways England in 2019, the tree was on the central reservation of a main A road, I think it was. It fell and caused a road traffic accident. In this case, there was a 3-year cycle of inspections, which was found to be inadequate with reference to the tree and its location in a position of what was called extreme high risk. The court here reiterated that even if there is a breach, though, causation must be established to show that the failure to inspect it sufficiently was actually the cause of the tree failure. So in terms of the general duty, it's what a reasonable and prudent landowner should do. The exact situation of the tree owner will be taken into account with the leaky measured duty. The higher the risk area the tree is in, the more the court will expect in terms of professional inspections of high frequency. The biggest balance here has got to be alerting tree owners to the risk of owning trees such that they're encouraged to effectively manage them, but not to scaremonger to the extent that an increase in proactive tree felling goes ahead to entirely eliminate risk. So if you are interested in hearing more about tree stuff, then a quick plug for the Tree Law Conference. If you want to take a moment and scan the QR codes, then you're welcome to come to that. Again, it'll be an online session like today, and that will be deep diving into tree preservation orders. So that is my session. Over to Tim.
All right, hopefully you can see my slides. Give me a thumbs up if you can, please. Excellent, thank you very much. All right, so we've spoken a bit, well, quite a lot about trees today. We're gonna move on a bit and look at how trees and ground conditions and weather conditions all play together and cause other issues for properties in our areas. So I'm Tim Farewell. A lot of my work revolves around modeling subsidence, ground movement, ground hazards, and a lot of that information is summarized in our book that we wrote with a large number of people in the industry a year or so ago, so you can grab that if you're interested. But really what we're talking about today is the overlap between trees, which we've covered, how trees in proximity to a vulnerable structure like a house with different foundation depths on a shrinkable clay soil, when you have a hot, dry summer, this can lead to ground movement, to subsidence. And you know, as we're going through this talk, we're going to look at some of these factors, how we can understand them better and get a sense of the risk that trees and ground conditions together cause to buildings. So first of all, we're going to look at soil conditions. There's about 1,000 different soil types in the UK, but here are 3 examples of soil, and you can see that they respond differently when water is present. So sand in the middle washes away, and this clay loam on the left-hand side, you can see it start to expand as it absorbs water into that, the matrix of the soil. So in summertime, this is effectively what happens. We call this a shrinkable clay soil, and you can see it's starting to lose water and shrink. So imagine that you have a tree in close proximity to a house, extracting water from the soil. That soil, that clay soil, will shrink. So when we're looking at ground movement types, there's a range of different types of soil movements which can lead to damage to a property. The most common and most important is clay-related shrinkage and swelling, which we see quite a lot in the southeast, London in particular. But what we're seeing, particularly in my work with the utilities, is those ground movements are moving more and more northwards as our climate is getting hotter and drier in the summer. I think Sarah spoke about landslides, other types of ground movements as well. Some of these are also impacted by climate change, as we will see through this presentation, but the predominant change which is coming is an increase in this clay-related shrinkage and swelling. So when we're looking at how this impacts on a property, it's all around differential movement, part of the property moving downwards more than another part. And you can see that when you have a tree present, it's generally that side of the building which moves down more than the other side. What does this look like in real life? Well, here are some examples where we've got cracks in the building as a result of subsidence. Sometimes they can be quite small, and sometimes they can get really quite scary to the point when you have something like this and you're like, well, we've got to really knock that down and start again. That is not redeemable. So when we go about mapping these, we first look at soil and geology, identify those parts of the country where these shrinkable ground conditions are present. Then we look at weather. And Sarah's asked me to talk a little bit about climate change and how this is likely to change some of these ground risks. And of course, you've seen the impact of windstorms on trees. Here's another type of a change which is coming, which is going to increase risk to property. As our summers get hotter and drier, we're going to see these soils drying out more and more. Of course, winters are set to get wetter as well, and it's the change between these wet conditions and dry conditions which can be really quite problematic. When I started mapping and modeling subsidence, we would always refer to 1961 to 1990 as the kind of the climate baseline. This is, standard climates for the UK. In the last 30 years, you can just see how much our climate has already changed. Climate change is not something which is coming in the future. It's already here. We are already in this period of change. Look how much hotter it is now in an average August compared to as it started out. And this is as a result of our emissions into the atmosphere. So, you hear a lot about carbon dioxide being a bad gas. And I just like to, almost counter that for a second and controversially say it's a good gas. It's like a cozy jumper around the earth. It keeps us warm. Without carbon dioxide, we would all die. We would all freeze. It is a wonderful insulator. Now, the problem is, of course, that we have just added layer upon layer upon layer of these cozy jumpers. And every time we jump on an airplane or eat beef or lamb, these high carbon foods, we are adding another layer, another sweater to the earth. And this is not new science, right? This was known in the 1980s. Margaret Thatcher, whatever you think of her, gave a really good speech, I think in 1989, 1990, something like that, to the UN. And she called for a unified response from global leaders to this catastrophe that was already being observed. And so at this point, they all came together and made plans to respond to this climate change crisis. And this is exactly what has happened. Nothing. We've continued to emit carbon dioxide at an ever increasing rate since that point. So our approach, our response as through politics have been really relatively limited. But there are some really encouraging signs now from local councils and forward-thinking organizations taking the mantle where national governments have failed. So that's encouraging. But this is the situation we're in at the moment. We've had a bit too much of a good thing, too many jumpers on, and the response of this is, of course, global temperature change is unprecedented. Really, it is. The last couple of years we've seen surface sea temperature breaking record upon record, as well as global surface temperatures, marine and land. And the problem with this is that we've kind of effectively reached a tipping point. This is 2023. This is not just a fraction of a degree higher. We're talking about things fundamentally changing in the regulation systems of the Earth. So when we're looking at this number about 1.5 degrees Celsius, the Paris Agreement is trying to keep us within this. I think we've actually passed that now, and we're starting to see the impacts. And you guys, as either in the insurance industry or county councils, you're starting to see these impacts on an annual basis. Obviously, deaths, thousands more deaths when we have heat wave events, droughts. So I do a lot of work with water companies and helping them build resilience into those networks so that water keeps flowing in these hot, dry conditions, but also damage to properties. When we have these hot, dry years like 2018, 2022, we see large numbers of summer bursts and also damage to properties through subsidence claims. And this is set to continue. So a lot of the models that I build use these 4 scenarios of, you may have heard of them, RCP, or representative concentration pathways, where the green line is if we all stop flying everywhere and eat a much more sustainable diet, and the red line is effectively if we carry on as we are. And it was only around Christmas time this year I thought, well, let's see how we are doing. Which of these scenarios are we on track for? And you can see this is the Mauna Loa Observatory, and you can see the seasonal changes in carbon dioxide each year. But effectively, we're tracking between the 2 worst scenarios at the moment. So a lot more action is required if we want to avoid the worst of what is coming in terms of climate change. What we're seeing here is a change in climate from the 1890s up until the 2020s. And here we start to look at future scenarios, and you can see this warming is set to continue and spread across much of the UK. And this is the best case scenario. If we put on the worst case scenario, it looks something like that, which is just so catastrophically bad. It scares the life out of me. So we can see, from the 1980s, go forward 100 years, England, Wales, even Scotland, and showing massive changes. We can't, I can't remember, it might have been Anthony who was saying we can't just look in the rear view mirror as to what's coming. You absolutely can't do that for climate change. We need to look ahead, see what is coming, and then prepare for that so that we can continue to provide services to the people that we serve. So just to summarize, climate change in the UK, we're coming towards hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters. These extreme weather events, storms, these are becoming a lot more common. And for coastal regions, of course, rising sea levels is a crisis which is unfolding. So what we try and do is build together these maps and identify pockets where it's safe to plant trees, where you might not want to insure properties if you're keen to avoid subs risks. That's really our bread and butter. When we're looking at how subsidence risk is likely to change over time, a typical insurer might have this kind of distribution across the UK. Vast majority, very low risk from subsidence events. But as we move to a future climate with hotter, drier conditions, what we're seeing is this shifting across of these properties as more and more of these properties are subject to the hot, dry conditions. And certain of those soils will shrink more, leading to more damage to properties. So at this point, people sometimes say, well, what realistically can we do? Individually, much like taxes, one person doing something is going to have a little impact, but collectively, like taxes, we can do a lot of good things if we all work together. And I just suggest 3 things which, if you want to be part of the solution, you can consider doing. So the first is, of course, looking at your pension plan, or if you're in the fortunate position to have other investments, move those towards climate sensitive plans. This is hardly ever spoken about, but by not funding climate destroying industries and actually funding companies who are trying to do the right thing, you can make a huge impact with this. You will have heard, of course, the huge damage caused by flying. So let's fly less, walk more, you'll end up healthier. And I think for me, one of the things which we can start to do a lot more is look about how we eat. So beef and lamb are hugely emitting in terms of methane. It's a very rapid warming greenhouse gas. And more companies and organizations, councils, universities are moving to a position where they're just not serving beef or lamb anymore on their campuses. And that's great. And the other thing we can do is just stop wasting food. So each slice of bread that we throw away is equivalent to like a whole A4 piece of ground land used to grow that wheat. So these can all add up, much like taxes. If we all play our part, we can make significant impacts to making the world a better place. I'd just like to flag up a couple of councils who I've noticed really trying to take this serious and go, what can we do as a council in terms of the food that we serve at our events to reduce the carbon on that? And there's about 16 universities as well who are going, let's move to plant-based catering wherever possible. So there's a lot of good work going out there. because what we need to do is build a collective response to address these kinds of risks, be it from trees falling or indeed the soil shrinking, moving, and causing damage to properties and our assets. So I hope that's been helpful. It's just one of many risks that we look at, but a really important one alongside trees and storm damage as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was great. We have been checking out the chat box and the Q&A. Most of it seems to have been over slides and slide malfunctions, so there aren't many questions for us to deal with here. But if you go away, or if you've watched this on catch up and questions crop up and you want to address them with any of us, then please do get in touch. You can email me at hello@treelaw.co.uk. If you'd like to watch this again, it will be on our YouTube channel relatively shortly. Our YouTube channel is Tree Law TV, so check that out, and obviously don't forget to like and subscribe. All that remains is for me to thank our speakers. I thank Anthony at Zurich very much, Kieran, and also Tim, and thank you all for attending. I hope you have found it very useful. Thank you very much, everybody.